Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this particular video, I will be doing an in-depth analysis behind abiogenesis. Abiogenesis essentially is the scientific explanation behind the process at which life generates itself from non-living matter, which is the current state model at which we then begin to see how we experience this universe. In abiogenesis, it speaks of certain processes such as polymerization, self-replication, on and on and on. There's a few key components, but ultimately the components dictate an event that which originates from outer space. And through these events in outer space, we then find a essentially descension of energy from space, which then takes form in bacteria and ultimately makes its way down into a habitable world, such as the Earth. Now, in this particular theory, we might find certain processes in the protocell, if I'm not mistaken. In the protocell, we might find certain processes start to look like stars in their constellation. These are the basic chemical reactions at which you could essentially find that the chemical compounds at which the energy of life can start to formulate itself through enzymes. And through these enzymes, this energy can create conducting material. Which through the conducting material, you could imagine now this enzyme can take form within a cell's membrane in a habitable space. But this enzyme essentially carries now life. It carries energy. And the understanding that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, it simply shifts states, which is another principle of physics. What might be a question at which we might drive what ultimately is a recognizable life form? Would some of you argue that according to the level of consciousness, that ultimately dictates if that is a life force or not? Because that's a big question. It can be taken in so many different directions. That would be as if saying that a lesser life form or a less conscious individual could then be seen as a non-existent life, if we were to veer in that direction of the argument. Or we could argue that all life forms have consciousness. They simply vary in the spectrum of self-awareness, of self-intelligence, on and on and on. But in understanding that each of these polar opposites ultimately dictate one particular truth, which is life and consciousness are the same thing. because they are both the dictating factors in both of these particular polar opposite statements. In understanding that life or consciousness is what is your life force, essentially. And in this life force is energy. And this energy starts at the abiogenesis process, which is ultimately where there is a recycling process of energy. And within the sky, you might now see the abiotic processes take form in constellations. These protocell-like mechanisms, you could essentially say that life stems and starts out at outer space, but doesn't fully take form until it finds a habitable world, such as Earth. And even within said Earth, you might find that there are different life forms to take form in itself. But in the question regarding in the abiogenesis process, what happens essentially to the life once it experiences consciousness? What is the measure of life, and what is the measure of consciousness? Some would argue that life starts when an individual is conscious, and some would argue that life starts when the individual is first created. Once again, when does life begin? Arises the question. Because now if we can point in the abiogenesis process that life itself begins much before the human existence, but through a spatial process, which is then materialized through the human experience into other human beings, the same way it would recreate itself through other mammals, other life forms, on and on and on. The question now might arise to what makes you a human? You see, in the understanding that a human is ultimately the most self-aware being, or also known as the most self-conscious being on Earth, which means we are technically the most reflective in our minds. But what might this abiogenesis process be linked to? The very consciousness, that which you then think within your mind. In the understanding that in a particular theory, it was stated that consciousness in itself was a bacteria that inhabited human beings. And that is what caused human beings to essentially become conscious. The belief was based around eating mushrooms that were present within cow patties while we were still apes. And through this fungus created a bacteria that resulted in now a hyper-conscious individual, developing a rapid change in metabolic processes that now resulted in a much larger cranial capacity for a much larger neural activity, a more intelligent being. But in the processes that consciousness might be a bacteria, well, what is essentially the process of abiogenesis? Abiogenesis is the act of life or non-living matter then becoming life. And so what might that look like to your thought process? In understanding, for one, that if said enzyme of energy created and ascended and descended to a habitable world to take on a membrane in a cell that allowed it to replicate and take on a form, ultimately you could argue that the reason that that individual is conscious or has a life in this thesis is based around the individual idea of the bacteria that is then created by the enzyme that can generate and self-replicate into a life form, such as us as a human being, or other life forms on Earth. The question now arose, what is life and what is consciousness? Because ultimately, life and consciousness are the same thing. It is the level of self-awareness. And now in the abiogenesis process, you might find that in this very process, your very thoughts are still energy that are entering into a habitable world, such as yourself. And now you might find that the actual root of the thought does not entirely belong to you in itself. It is if you choose to claim and vocalize or essentially express said thought, that that thought becomes yours. But until then, it is just freely entering, just as within anybody else. The ultimate question is, where is the true source? Because we can ultimately say in science, based on this theory, that something created itself from nothing. We can look at that particular statement, which doesn't sound quite believable, and yet it is the actual process science explains the creation of the universe. That something created itself from nothing. That's what the process of abiogenesis is. Life creating itself from non-living matter. But if the potential for life was not there within said non-living matter, even to the slightest degree of a percentage, if there was zero, complete, absolute zero potential, could the universe create itself based on nothing? At zero. Because I could go 0, 0, all of a sudden I have a structure. Add 0, 0 once more, another structure. And this creates infinite replication, known as reflection. But in the process of understanding that, there needs to be a consciousness presence for this universe to essentially take form. And that begs a question now regarding the source of said life. Because ultimately the point this theory can point towards, but doesn't necessarily come to a conclusion with, is that if life can be created from nothing, and that consciousness essentially is the source of life. If in this particular statement you could argue that consciousness is the moment an individual becomes alive. If that is the basis around the fact that something can be created from nothing. The question now arises, when did you become alive? And when did you become conscious? As some of there may be, not everyone, unfortunately, has the same spectrum of self-awareness, known as being a conscious individual. And so now I invite this thought through this abiogenetic process to you. Invite the source into your life, and you may find where you truly began. Thank you.